Genghis Khan, 1162 to 1227, gathered to his bosom many of his conquered enemies, wives and daughters. A 2003 study revealed that about 38 million people, or 1 in 200 of the world's population, are his descendants. The founder of the Mongol Empire, the world's largest contiguous empire, he was one of history's most terrifying figures. The estimated 40 million deaths toll of the Mongol conquests he initiated, viewed as a percentage of the world's population in his day, would be equivalent to 278 million deaths if adjusted for the 20th century. Extrapolated to the modern era, his victims would have been about 4 to 6 times greater than those of Hitler, Stalin and Mao combined. Following are 20 historical facts about Genghis Khan and his Mongols. Genghis Khan was born and raised in a harsh environment. Genghis Khan and his Mongols were born and raised in the Eurasian steppe, a plains region stretching from Manchuria in the east to Hungary and Croatia in the west. A harsh land of scorching summers and extreme winters, the steppe's saving grace was its abundant grasslands, which allowed the raising of vast herds of livestock. As a result, the region was inhabited for millennia by nomadic tribes, who wandered with their herds from pasturage to pasturage. The nomads often traded with their neighbors in the settled lands surrounding the steppe, but whenever opportune, they were just as comfortable raiding them. The Mongols were the most significant in a long line of terrifying steppe nomads. The violence and fury of Genghis Khan's Mongols was not the first nomadic eruption from the steppe. For millennia, the region's nomads had frequently ridden out of the vastness of their homelands to raid, plunder, pillage, and otherwise terrorize the more civilized and prosperous lands on their periphery. If the nomads were unified under powerful warlords, there was always a potential for things to escalate from mere raids, bad enough as those were, and into devastating invasions that could extinguish empires. Steppe nomads had the advantage of strategic mobility. As with other steppe nomads, the Mongols had some advantages that gave them an edge against their settled neighbors. Chief among those was their mobility. Nomads grew up with, and often on horses. Accustomed to a life on the move, the nomads were seldom tied to a specific location whose defense obligated them to stand up and fight. After raiding into the settled lands, the nomads were often able to depart with their booty before the civilized authorities had mobilized a response. If their victims pursued them into the steppe, the nomads often had the luxury of choosing when, where and whether to fight. The Mongols' horses gave them battlefield mobility. In addition to strategic mobility, the Mongols had some tactical advantages that gave them an edge over the armies of their civilized neighbors. First and foremost among those was that the nomad forces were entirely cavalry. Mounted on horseback, the nomad steeds gave them a battlefield mobility that made it difficult to force them to fight to the death. If a battle started going against them, the nomads could often ride away and retreat, to lick their wounds, and live to fight another day. The Mongols' main weapon gave them an edge. Another advantage enjoyed by Mongols and other steppe nomads was their preferred weapon, the recurved composite bow. The steppe bow was an ingenious marvel that combined animal horn on one side for compression and elastic sinew on the other for tension, allowing it to store a significant amount of energy in a relatively compact weapon that could be used from horseback. It could pack a greater punch and shoot further than simpler wooden stave bows. That created tactical mismatches that often gave steppe warriors a standoff distance from which to kill in relative safety. Steppe nomads could thus attrit less mobile armies with arrows until they were weakened and demoralized, before swooping in to finish them off. Life on the steppe produced a deep pool of tough warriors. Another advantage enjoyed by Mongols and their steppe kin arose from the disadvantage of living in the steppe, a harsh existence, much of it spent on horseback, that created a deep pool of hardy warriors. In the settled lands, only a minority could be mobilized as fighters, because the majority were needed in the fields and workshops. The steppe nomads had no fields and little manufacture, while their food source, their animal flocks and herds, could be cared for by children and women, that left nearly the entire adult male population of fighting age available as warriors. Genghis Khan was preceded by other terrifying steppe warlords. Genghis Khan and his Mongols were not the first steppe tribesmen to terrify the civilized world. In the 7th century BC, the Scythians, Iranian-speaking nomads, who inhabited the steppe between China and the Carpathians, began raiding into the settled lands of the Middle East. In 612 BC, the Scythians played a key role in destroying the Assyrian Empire, forever extinguishing a nation that had existed for over a millennium and that had dominated the Middle East for centuries. The Scythians and Persians. The Assyrians were eventually replaced by the Persians as the Middle East dominant power. In 513 BC, Persian king Darius I sought to end Scythian raids on his empire by conquering them. So he assembled a huge army and launched an invasion of Scythia along the western Black Sea coast and into today's southern Ukraine and Russia. The nomads simply retreated into the vastness of the steppe, taking their families and herds with them, and avoiding the decisive pitched battle that Darius sought. Instead they pulled back, laying waste the countryside in the Persians' path, blocking wells and destroying pastures, while attriting the invaders with skirmishes and hit-and-run attacks. Attrition as a steppe warfare tactic. Darius challenged the Scythians to stand up and fight, or admit their weakness and submit. The Scythian leader's response, as recorded by Herodotus, highlights the difficulty the forces of civilization had in forcing steppe nomads to fight if they did not want to. This is my way, O Persian. I have never fled in fear from any man, and I do not flee from you now. We have neither cities nor cultivated land for which we might be willing to fight with you, fearing that they might be taken or ravaged. As for lords, I recognize only my ancestors Zeus and Hestia. As to you calling yourself my lord, I tell thee to go weep. Darius was forced to give up and retreat, while the Scythians continued raiding for centuries. Other Mongol predecessors, the Xiongnu. In 200 BC, China's Emperor Jesu, founder of the Han dynasty, was plagued by Xiongnu tribesmen raiding his realm, so he invaded their territory. The Xiongnu led the Chinese army on a merry chase through the steppe, while harrying its supply lines and fraying its nerves with frequent skirmishes. When the Chinese were exhausted, the Xiongnu ambushed and trapped them in a disadvantageous locale, cutting them off from resupply and reinforcement. Emperor Jesu bought his life with an appeasement treaty that recognized the Xiongnu as equals, sent their leaders Chinese princesses as brides, and sought to buy them off with tribute payments, face-savingly referred to as gifts. Other Mongol predecessors, the Huns. Perhaps the closest analog to the medieval Mongol eruption was that of the Huns in the dying days of the Roman Empire. By the 5th century AD, the Huns ruled a steppe empire that reached into Eastern and Central Europe. Scary to begin with, the Huns became outright terrifying under the leadership of Attila, reigned 434 to 453, who earned the moniker the Scourge of God. He terrorized the Eastern and Western Roman empires, plundered the Balkans, extorted tons of gold from Constantinople, invaded Gaul and struck into Italy, before drinking himself to death on his wedding night. The Mongols were an insignificant tribe before Genghis. Before Genghis, the Mongols were an obscure tribe, roaming the steppe north of China. When not fighting neighboring tribes, Mongol clans and factions fought against each other just as they had done for centuries. Then they were united under a charismatic and capable leader named Temujin. Having united the Mongols, Temujin went about conquering and absorbing neighboring tribes, and forming them into a Mongol nation. He then adopted the title Genghis Khan, or Universal Ruler, and set out to conquer the world. Genghis Khan survived a horrifically impoverished childhood. Genghis Khan was born Temujin, the son of a minor Mongol chieftain. When Temujin was 9, his father was murdered, and tribal rivals then banished his widow and her family of 5 children to fend for themselves on the harsh steppe. It was a veritable death sentence, but Temujin's mother managed to keep her children alive, or at least managed to keep most of them alive. The family endured such dire want and poverty, and things got so bad, that Temujin killed an older brother for refusing to share a fish. Genghis Khan grew into a tough but charismatic leader. Temujin grew into a tough but charismatic man, and as a youth, he began amassing a small and devoted following. He had an instinct for tribal politics, and he parlayed his steadily growing band of followers into bringing the disparate Mongol clans under his sway, one after another, until he had unified the entire tribe under his leadership. Temujin then implemented sweeping reforms, aimed at erasing intra-tribal distinctions. He accomplished that by the extreme but effective expedient of exterminating the Mongols' fractious tribal aristocracy. He then combined the commoners into a unified tribe, bound by their personal allegiance to Temujin. After unifying the Mongols, Genghis conquered neighboring tribes. After unifying the Mongols, Temujin set his sight on neighboring tribes. He began by taking on the formidable rival Tatars. After defeating them, he executed all Tatar males taller than a wagon's axle. By 1206, Temujin had destroyed all steppe rivals, and the formerly squabbling tribes had been united into a Mongol nation. So a grand assembly was held that year, where he revealed a vision, endorsed by shamans, in which he claimed that the heavens had ordained that he rule all under the sky. The Mongols supported that vision, and proclaimed Temujin Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. Genghis Khan turned the Mongols into a war machine. To fulfill his heavenly mandate of ruling all under the sky, Genghis Khan set about transforming the Mongols into a war machine capable of conquering all under the sky. Genghis was a good judge of men, and a great talent spotter, who created a military meritocracy, in which advancement was open to all who proved themselves capable, regardless of their origins. He subjected the hitherto fractious nomadic warriors to strict military discipline. It was hard, but not overly harsh or unreasonable, and he drilled and trained them constantly. Genghis conquered with numerically inferior forces. When people think of Mongol hordes, they often picture vast swarms of disorganized barbarians who attacked in a wild charge and overwhelmed their enemy with numbers and reckless savagery. In reality, however, Genghis Mongols seldom had numerical superiority over their foes. Instead, they swept across Eurasia and conquered a vast empire despite being severely outnumbered by their enemies. Indeed, Genghis and his warriors won their empire by routinely annihilating opposing forces that outnumbered them by factors of 2 to 1, 3 to 1 and 4 to 1 or more. Genghis men won despite their numerical inferiority because they were professionals who were extremely good at warfare. Genghis warriors were born cavalrymen. The Mongols and other steppe nomads absorbed by Genghis Khan had been riding horses since they were toddlers, and had been taught how to master the bow and arrow since early childhood, and made them prime cavalry material when they joined Genghis' army, where they underwent extensive training that transformed them into a mounted elite. Genghis saw to it that his men practiced the individual skills of archery and horsemanship almost daily, and had them trained constantly to master unit tactics. He drilled them in maneuvers, formation changes, rotations, advances, retreats, and massed archery, until they became second nature. Genghis Khan revolutionized steppe warfare. Genghis Khan further revolutionized steppe warfare by placing his warriors in a well-organized hierarchical structure, with an effective chain of command, in place of the traditional ad hoc tribal units, based on kinship groups. He created a military organization based on decimals, with a hierarchy of ranks. At the base were squads of 10 men known as an arbans. 10 arbans were combined into a company of 100 known as a zuan. 10 zuans made a regiment of 1,000 known as a mingan. 10 mingans were formed into a division of 10,000 known as a chuman. 2 or more tumans were formed into armies. A separate imperial guard of 10,000 men protected Genghis and leading Mongol figures. Genghis' favorite battlefield tactics. 60% of Genghis Mongols were trained as light cavalry archers, and the rest were trained as armored heavy cavalry, wielding lances as their main weapon. One of Genghis' favorite tactics, for which he incessantly trained his men, was to attrit the enemy from a distance with arrows. Once the enemy was judged sufficiently weakened, a signal would be given for a charge by the heavy cavalry, which skewered the enemy with their lances before setting about them with sabers. Another favored tactic in which he drilled his men was a feigned retreat, to lure the enemy into pursuing them. Then at the right time and place, the pursued Mongols would suddenly turn and countercharge or surround their pursuers.